Hello everyone, RJM3 here. Welcome back to What If, the alternate history series where I speculate what could have been if history had gone differently. Happy 4th of July, a wonderful day to celebrate the independence of the best country on earth. A day so glorious that you nearly forget that America's prosperity at home and hegemony abroad have been constantly subverted and undermined by a decrepit neoliberal establishment for the past several decades. Anyway, I have a special scenario in store for you all today.
Long ago, in the distant past of 2016, fellow alternate history YouTuber Matt Mitrovich celebrated the 4th of July by uploading the video Top 5 American Revolution What Ifs, in which he examined 5 possible turning points during the war which could have potentially led to a British victory. But this year, I plan on going in a very different direction. Rather than speculate on the British triumphing over the 13 colonies, instead, I want to ask, what if Britain's defeat in the war was so catastrophic that the British Empire literally collapsed? Now, I know it sounds like a ridiculous scenario with no basis in reality that I just pulled out of thin air, but the idea of Britain losing its empire in the wake of the American Revolution was an actual fear felt by British leaders in the final years of the war. You see, last fall, I attended a college class on alternate history, What If? Introduction to Counterfactual History, taught by Gabrielle Rosenfeld, editor of the Counterfactual History Review, editor behind What Ifs of Jewish History, author of The World Hitler Never Made and many other novels, and an online friend of Matt Mitrovich, so kind of a big deal. Anyway, when the class was discussing works of alternate history on the Revolutionary War, one of those works really caught my interest. A 2007 article titled How a Revolution Saved an Empire, written by a retired British general from the Yugoslav Wars, Michael Rose. Rose's article stated that King George III, Prime Minister Lord North, and his ministry dominated by the Tory party were certain that a British withdrawal from the 13 colonies would quickly spiral into a series of events which would lead to Britain losing its whole empire, either through further rebellion or conquest by its rivals, forcing Britain into a state of geopolitical irrelevance. Upon hearing the news of the surrender of British General Charles Cornwallis in the fall of Yorktown to the Continental Army in 1781, Prime Minister North threw his arms in the air and famously exclaimed, "Oh God, it's all over." But as the article humorously points out, their idea of the war's aftermath, just like their handling of the war itself, was entirely wrong. In 1782, Lord North was booted out of office in a vote of no confidence and replaced by the opposition leader of the Whig Party, the second Marquis of Rockingham, who began peace negotiations to end the war. On September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, officially recognizing American independence and ceding all British territory east of the Mississippi River. According to Rose, rather than being the catalyst for Britain's downfall, the end of the war and the loss of the 13 colonies gave the British Empire new life. New visionary politicians like Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger saw beyond the defeat, foreseeing new opportunities for Britain from the oncoming process of industrialization, and planned for Britain's rapid recovery from the war both politically and economically, eventually producing a large quantity of the world's goods. Pitt's passing of the India Act of 1784 placed greater oversight on the British East India Company and centralized control of the subcontinent, ensuring the mistakes in the colonial administration of America wouldn't be repeated in India or anywhere else. Pitt had even vigorously worked to rebuild Britain's navy and army, preparing them for the coming wars with revolutionary and Napoleonic France a few years later. It was this article that made me wonder, what if, after the siege of Yorktown, rather than accepting their defeat, the British Empire doubled down on trying to crush the United States, and squandered whatever military and economic strength they had left fighting the Continental Army, and the very nightmare they feared came to pass.
So to properly celebrate this patriotic occasion, I'll be speculating what would have happened if America not only freed itself, but brought down the very empire that tried to stop it. What if the American Revolution destroyed the British Empire?
February 27th, 1782. History diverges when Parliament narrowly votes to not force Prime Minister North to resign and to not end the war in America. Lord Rockingham would be very vocally disgusted by Parliament's decision, But just like in our timeline, he dies of influenza a few months later. The British Army mobilizes its largest force for one more major offensive in the colonies, one that could finally crush the rebellion and restore morale to the British public. But as Rose pointed out, King George III had a very fundamental misunderstanding of how to engage with the colonists. The British tried to fight a conventional war against insurgents. They never established a counterinsurgency, never rallied support from the Loyalists, and failed to cut off the Continental Army's supplies from France. So this last offensive, wherever it takes place, whatever cities are captured, even if it completely succeeds in all of its objectives, does not work. Motivated by the revolution's ideals of independence and freedom, and kept in line by the charismatic leadership of George Washington, the Continental Army can still fight on. Over the next couple of years, British forces would be faced with atrocious guerrilla fighting. Britain's economy finally breaks. Goodwill with the British public has evaporated. North is finally removed from office by Parliament and replaced by the second Earl of Shelburne, and Britain is forced to pull whatever measly forces it has left out of America. The Peace of Paris in this alternate timeline would have been far less favorable for the British. Lands captured from the British during the war by rivaled powers but eventually returned in our timeline are not. The French are allowed to keep all British territories in the Caribbean that they captured during the war, including Grenada, St. Vincent, Dominica, St. Christopher, Nevis, and Montserrat. The Spanish get to keep the Bahamas. With the Royal Navy too distracted in blockading the U.S. and patrolling the Caribbean, the Spanish are able to lay a successful siege and capture Gibraltar. The Dutch, meanwhile, are not forced to surrender the city of Negapatam in India to the British. The British come out of the war with nothing to show for it except for a much smaller empire, a battered military, and a bankrupt treasury. But fear not, for William Pitt the Younger is now here to save the day, and he's dead. Pitt was always a very sickly individual throughout his entire life, constantly troubled by a number of illnesses, which in our timeline finally killed him in 1806 at age 46. But in this alternate timeline, as a secondary point of divergence, Pitt dies 20 years ahead of schedule, shortly before the war's end and before he can ever become Prime Minister. So Britain is left stuck with the consequences of its failed war. The outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789 rattled the European continent. In 1792, the monarchies of Europe declared war on revolutionary France to quickly stamp out the spread of revolutionary republican ideals, starting the War of the First Coalition and eventually the War of the Second Coalition. In both conflicts, the new French Republic was not only able to defend itself, but established several sister republics across Western Europe. In this alternate timeline, the British government is particularly troubled by the revolution. Out of fear of its more impoverished populace rising up, there is a strong crackdown against political dissidents across England. Many political dissidents are arrested and need to be deported elsewhere. Now, around this time, to at least partially recuperate their losses in the Americas, the British set their sights on new lands in the East. Australia, or as it was known back then, Terra Australis, or New Holland. First settling in the southeast corner of the continent, the British chose to use it as a prison colony. This colony eventually grew to encompass the entire continent, forming the Commonwealth of Australia. But in this alternate timeline, a larger number of political prisoners have been sent to the land down under. This move backfires when the colony is quickly overcome by a revolt started by these new political prisoners, inspired by the American Revolution, and wanted to start their own country in a distant corner of the globe, far away from the Crown's influence, founding the Republic of New Albion. New Albion was a previously rejected name for the city of Sydney, with Albion being a niche, alternative name for Britain. As the French Revolution is tearing through Europe, Britain must send its already stretched thin army to prevent the loss of yet another colony. As this is happening, in India, the Maratha Confederacy is becoming increasingly annoyed with the British East India Company. Without the 1784 India Act, the East India Company continued its harsher treatment of the native populace for profit. With the EIC continuously crossing the line and the British being distracted in Europe and Australia, the Marathas decide to kick the British off the continent, kick-starting the Second Anglo-Maratha War several years earlier, further straining the British military. Now, in our timeline, in 1798, Ireland actually rose up in rebellion against the British with the support of the French, But despite initial success, the British Army eventually crushed the revolt. But in this alternate timeline, the Irish rebels are far more emboldened due to Britain's catastrophic defeat in the American Revolution and the ongoing revolt in Australia, and so are able to rally more support from the Irish population. The British Army, on the other hand, is simply too small and too demoralized to stop the rebellion. With so many territories in revolt or under invasion all at once, the overextended British Army and Royal Navy cannot cope. Just like in America, the British are driven out of Australia. The Maratha Confederacy overwhelms the British regulars in EIC and Bengal and North Sikars, ending Britain's presence in India. Ireland is finally able to throw off the yoke of British rule and create their own republic. As quickly as it rose, the British Empire came crashing down. With the loss of all of its colonies, influence, strength, and prestige, the rump state of Britain is forced to watch as one Napoleon Bonaparte seizes control of France and conquers Europe. Without Britain, Napoleon has no need to worry about the Royal Navy or the Russians trading with the British. From Madrid to Warsaw, Napoleon's empire not only survives, but thrives. France has become the predominant power of Europe and the world, while Britain is little more than an insignificant island in the North Sea. So how would the 19th century without the British Empire look? In North America, it is only a matter of time before Canada is conquered by the United States in the War of 1812, but probably sooner. In our timeline, Russia had to compete with Britain diplomatically over the control of Central Asia in an event known as the Great Game. But without Britain, the Russian Empire has free rein to take over Afghanistan and Persia. Perhaps the Russians could even succeed in their dream of taking Constantinople from the Ottomans in this alternate timeline's version of the Crimean War. Assuming the Napoleonic order in Europe isn't as much of a formidable enemy as the British Empire, or has already collapsed by that point after Napoleon died. In South Africa, the French would have seized the Cape Colony from the Dutch, so the Boers, the original Dutch colonists of the land, would have spent the next century in conflict with the French Empire rather than Britain. In India, the Maratha Confederacy survives and controls the interior of the subcontinent, though the coast is still controlled by Europeans. Without Britain, India is never fully brought under colonialism. The Opium Wars in China would have also never happened without the British Empire, but the century of humiliation in which China was defeated by multiple foreign powers in a short span of time is not prevented. The Qing dynasty's doomed struggle against the industrialized world was inevitable. The century of humiliation would have been delayed by about a couple of decades at most likely started by a war with France or maybe Russia. The Australian continent is never united under one country. Without a sufficiently large population or infrastructure, the new Albionians are only able to control the eastern portion of the continent. The rest of the continent is eventually settled by European powers, likely the Portuguese in the north and the French in the southwest. Without the largest empire in human history, the balance of power across the world is completely upended. Other empires have filled the power vacuum. Some powers have won or maintained their sovereignty, others were wiped off the map. Beyond this point, I would only be guessing as to what could happen next. But the main takeaway here is that because an empire got too stubborn and stuck to old ways, it inadvertently started its own downfall. An important lesson to any present-day superpowers teetering on collapse.
So to all my American viewers, I wish you all a happy Independence Day, and I hope you all enjoy whatever celebrations you have planned for today. To all my non-American viewers, I hope you're having a good Monday. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and follow me on Instagram. This has been RJM3, Alternate Historian. Have a nice day.